Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's discussion, examining Black youth participation in sports and physical activity, barriers, opportunities, and pathways forward. I'm Daisha McClam, Vice President of Community Engagement and Advocacy for Positive Coaching Alliance, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator for today's conversation. Sports and physical activity play a major role in shaping young lives, not just in terms of competition, but in building confidence, fostering community, and supporting overall health and well-being. Yet, Black youth continue to face unique barriers when it comes to access, representation, and support in sports. Whether it's the overemphasis on elite competition, the lack of diverse sports options, or the need for better resources, these challenges deserve our attention. Today, we're diving into the realities of Black youth participation in sports, what's working, what's missing, and most importantly, how can we create more opportunities for all young athletes to thrive? We have an incredible panel here to share their insights, and we encourage you to be a part of the conversation. Before we delve into our discussion, let me introduce you to our esteemed panelists who bring a wealth of experience and insights to the table. First, we have Dr. Joseph Cooper. Dr. Cooper is the inaugural Dr. J. Keith Motley Endowed Chair of Sport Leadership and Administration, the former inaugural Special Assistant to the Chancellor for Black Life, and the founding Executive Director of the New Balance Institute for Innovative Leadership in Sport at the University of Massachusetts, UMass, Boston. His research focuses on the intersection between sport, race, gender, education, and culture, with a specific emphasis on sport involvement as a catalyst for holistic development and positive social change. Please welcome Dr. Cooper. Joining us as well is Dr. Alpha Alexander. Dr. Alexander began her career as a graduate assistant in women's athletics at Temple University. She was the assistant women's athletic director from 1980 to 1983, and then transitioned to the women's athletic director from 81 to 83. In 1992, Dr. Alexander co-founded the Black Women in Sport Foundation in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with Tina Sloan Green, Nikki Frank, and Linda Green. Welcome, Dr. Alexander. Also joining us is Lino Sanchez. Lino has over 25 years of experience working with inner city youth. His dedication derives from his own personal experience, which started in the same manner as many urban youth today, growing up in a world of limited options and narrow horizons. As the founder of Urban Achievers, Massachusetts' first sport industry-based high school, he is driven to redefine education through sport, creating new opportunities for young people from primarily opportunity-challenged communities who share a passion for the sport. Please welcome Lino Sanchez. And finally, Jerica Williams. Jerica is a trailblazing leader, a dynamic coach, and a transformative force in the realm of basketball, business, and community. As the founder and chief storyteller of Her Power Productions, a platform dedicated to amplifying the voices of girls and young women, she has built a legacy of empowerment, helping individuals recognize and harness their inner strength. Please join me in welcoming Jerica. Thank you all. So we don't need to hear from me. Let's kick off our conversation. To everyone, I just want to start by talking a little bit and learning a little bit about your individual sports journeys and how that led to where you are and the type of work that you've built throughout your years. We can start with Dr. Cooper and move metaphorically down the line.
Thank you, Deja. Happy Black History Month to all who are in attendance. And I say that proudly, especially in these times. Honored to be here with my fellow co-panelists. In terms of my sports journey, I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. And in the state of North Carolina, basketball is a way of life. I can mention a number of famous athletes who either attended school in North Carolina or who ascended to prominence in the state of North Carolina. the one that's most commonly known to all of you is Michael Jordan. But I did grow up in an era where he and a number of others had an impressionable impact on my development. Charlotte Smith, who was a standout basketball player on the championship Tar Heel team in the 90s as well. And I also played soccer growing up as well. My father is of Liberian descent. And so in West Africa, football, as it's known globally, but in the United States, soccer was very popular. So for my development in terms of my racial identity development, my gender identity development, as well as my social, emotional, leadership, and academic development, were very much connected to my involvement in sport.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. I feel like many of us, that resonates with several of us, several parts of our identity are rooted in our sport experience. Dr. Alexander, do you have similar thoughts when you think of sports in your younger ages and how that?
I have quite different thoughts due to the fact in high school, I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, and at my high school, there was no sports for girls. Consequently, through a friend of my mother's, I was able to play and learn tennis and became the city of Dayton champion. Forward from there, I attended the College of Wooster, which was predominantly white institution in Wooster, Ohio. But I had an opportunity to participate in 4 sports for girls. At that time, they had 13 sports available at that private institution. Due to those experiences, it really propelled me of the interest. There was something I knew was wrong because I was the only a woman of color participating in the sport. I wanted to try to make an impact. Consequently, the founding of Black Women's Sports Foundation.
Well, I think we can all agree that you've made a significant impact, and we're very thankful for the work that you've done and what has inspired that. In similar fashion, Lino, how have some of your younger experiences connected to sports shaped the impact that you have chosen to make as you move into your adult life and your career?
Oh, thank you for that question. So for as long as I can remember, chaos was always my reality, right? I grew up in a community that was dangerous. You know, my home was no refuge. And the only place I felt alive was on the basketball court, right? Hoops gave me structure. It gave me purpose. It gave me hope. And I believed in the dream that basketball would help me and my family out of the projects and into a better financial situation. You know, I remember one day in high school after meeting with my principal about making up some missing assignments due to some games we were at. I was told that I had to make a choice between my passion for basketball and my responsibility as a student. Because according to her, school was about learning and not playing. I walked away from school that day, never imagining that my next stop wouldn't be a college gymnasium or a professional career. Instead, at 17 years old, I found myself walking into a prison. And decades later, as an educator and a coach, I found myself working in the very system that once told me sport was just a hobby, you know, something to be set aside for a real education, right? And watching my students struggle with the same impossible choices I had made me realize just how deeply flawed the system was, you know, so, you know, just how could they tell us that our dreams and our passions didn't matter, you know, or how could they dismiss the very thing that fueled our identity and our hope for the future? You know, this is why I started Urban Achievers, to redefine education and prove that sport isn't a distraction, but a powerful tool for success, schools, and careers in life.
Absolutely. That's something that we often say, that sport done the right way is a transformative experience for our youth that they each deserve to get.
Sure.
So thank you very much. And thank you for the commitment that you're making to the community that you reside in. Similarly, I think, Jerica, you are a trailblazer in making waves and amplifying the voices of young girls across this nation. What from your younger years really propelled you into this path?
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here, Dr. Alexander. I have to acknowledge, thank you for your work in trailblazing the path so that women like me could play and coach So I just wanted to acknowledge that. But as a young girl, it's really important to me because for a long time I fell into basketball on accident, and I was the only girl until for the most part until I got to about 13 or 14 years old on all boys teams. And so becoming a player, I was able to get a scholarship to UCLA to play basketball, and then transferred to San Diego State and have coached on every level from Division I men's to high school girls basketball to youth. And so all of that perspective, now I'm a mother of an athlete. And so all of these perspectives, I feel like for a long time, what garnered me to want to coach was to be the woman I felt like I needed. And so from all of these lenses, I feel like I have a very unique take and perspective on what they need and how I connect with them. And so to be able to be in this space, I feel like my life has been research in youth sports, especially with the Black youth sports community. So I think just being alive and being me is the real reason why I'm dedicated to this work.
Thank you very much. And I completely agree. Oftentimes we fail to recognize that we're experts of our lived experience. And so we bring a wealth of insight to the work that we're doing. And I think it's very clear, there's already a theme coming up from each of your journeys and each of your experiences, that it's not always easy to access sport and to thrive in sport, although sport really is the catalyst for such awesome things. But stepping back and looking specifically at some of those stopping points that made it difficult for you guys to progress in the areas that you really loved, either the fact that there were only a few things, Dr. Alexander, the teachers who literally spoke against your love, Lino, and like so many others that we know personally or we have experienced. There's a number of moments that people have where it's a little bit more difficult. So in that frame, looking at it from a research standpoint, Dr. Alexander and Dr. Cooper, what are some of the most significant systemic and socioeconomic barriers that have come up in your research that prevent Black youth from accessing sport and physical activity?
Then you can go first.
Okay, all right. There's several and probably many more. And I'll list them and then we can discuss it. One is economic differences, the lack of accessible facilities, cultural barriers, gender norms, limited community support. And don't laugh, but I live in Tennessee now, in the South. So urban versus rural settings. I used to live 18 years in New York City and came here to this little town called Marshtown, Tennessee. And the differences of space availability and constraints really make an impact. Those are some of the items that I want to put on the table for discussion today. Dr. Cooper.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'll echo what Dr. Alexander said. A colleague of mine, Dr. Lori Martin at Louisiana State University, uses the term sport deserts to refer to communities that have a lack of adequate access to safe, high quality sport and physical activity spaces. So because Black youth are still experiencing the reverberations of Jim Crow, of the desegregation era, the inadequate resources dating all the way back to slavery, we still have a large racial wealth gap in our society, and that impacts the quality and type of opportunities that our youth experience. Another aspect is the inverse relationship, as Dr. Alexander mentioned, between the defunding of public available community sport, school-based sport opportunities compared to the private pay-for-play model. So now, in order to have any resemblance of high-quality athletic training, you have to pay. And unless you have a sponsor, and I know we're going to get into a little bit later how some of these athletic and apparel companies, there's mixed experiences with their involvement in sponsoring youth sports. In some ways, it can be helpful. In other ways, it can be exploitative. But that creates barriers as well. And the last thing that I'll mention, just to reiterate what Dr. Alexander mentioned, is that there's gendered, racialized allocation of resources. And that means that in many ways, Black girls are disadvantaged and Black young women, Black boys and Black men, young men, are also denied access to a wider range of sporting opportunities beyond the ones that have been racially deemed as that's what you're supposed to do, i.e. football, basketball, and track and field. I would also just briefly mention that there's a lack of emphasis on opportunities for our youth who have unique and adaptive intellectual and physical abilities. So we know that the Special Olympics and the Paralympics have been growing in popularity in adaptive sport, but in many cases across various communities, as Dr. Alexander mentioned, whether it's rural versus metropolitan or other areas, there's not equitable access to sporting, to adaptive sport opportunities for our youth.
And
I just-
Dr. Alexander, as you were
Yeah.
starting the Black Women in Sport Foundation, what
Mhm.
were some of these, like, if you had to pick, this is difficult, but maybe like those top 2 or 3 that you really saw that just kept coming up and you really made it intentional that we want to combat these particular barriers that continue to show up over and over again for our young ladies?
Well, particularly the racial differences, but most importantly, in terms of the gender. And I wanted to say, when I put my finger up, I always thought Title IX occurred 1972. Title IX should have included gender and race at that time, incorporated in that law. And unfortunately, it did not. The ramifications and why the Black Women's Sports Foundation was founded, we typically tried to nurture young Black girls into what we call non-traditional sports, gymnastics. Nikki Frank is one of the co-founders, fencing. Tina Salone Green, one of the co-founders, lacrosse and field hockey. Tracy Green is now the president of the Black Women's Sports Foundation. She's the tennis coach at Harvard. So tennis. So we really concentrated in terms of really incorporating and really trying to get young Black girls into what we call the non-traditional sport.
And I think that's directly combating a number of things that you guys just mentioned in regards to the economic barriers, the lack of opportunities for non-traditional, not letting them just fall into what I fell into, basketball and track. Those are the sports I touched. So like learning and having that exposure, but also having the representation of seeing like a Tracy Green, who is a coach at a collegiate level, that those type of examples and models are really revolutionary in regards to changing the norms, as you mentioned. What are the mental models attached to sports, and how, as a society, we're looking at the opportunities that should exist. So then there can be more change. So I thank you and appreciate those setting that example to change some of those mindsets. Some of the other the things that we thought of in regards to barriers, I know they show up every day with our youth. And Jerica and Lena, as you guys are working with youth on a day-to-day basis, how have you seen issues like transportation, access to facilities, or financial costs really impact in the Black youth participation in organized sports? I'll start with Lino because he seems really, really ready, and then I'll pass over to Jerica after that.
No, well, I appreciate you. Thank you so much. You know, as I'm sure Jerica knows, and I'm sure all of you know, you know, these issues create significant barriers. You know, and we're talking about, you know, when I think about it, think about my kids in particular, you know, their families, we're talking long travel distances, right? A lot of these so-called quality programs are often located outside of our communities. And a lot of these families, you know, they have issues of getting their kids to and from practices and trainings and things of that nature. I think that's one of the barriers. Another thing that I believe is a barrier is several of our parents work multiple jobs, you know, to try to make sure they make ends meet. And, you know, some of them are working non-traditional hours, you know, which obviously makes it even more difficult to drive their children back and forth. One issue that I one barrier that that's really, hits home for me is restricted facility usage. In our communities, we have these community centers, but even within those community centers, access is limited, due to high rental costs. It's crazy because they're charging families through the roof to get their kids into the gymnasium or to get them into the weight room or to even be in programs. School policy restrictions or excessive club partnerships. And if it's not that, it's overcrowding and poor conditions, in some of our community centers and gymnasiums or parks. So those are just, some of the barriers that I see, and I'm sure that Jerica could, add to this list as well.
Absolutely. I think that shows up in just about every city, as well as in our rural spaces of the lack of access. Dr. Alexander, specifically in some of the rural spaces, just how do you get to those locations? But then when we look in some of our urban communities, how do we actually make sure they're open during the hours that our youth can access them, and how do we make sure that they're well maintained to make sure it's going to be a quality experience? So there's several layers to that. Jerica, can you give us a little bit of insight into what you've seen in the communities that you've been working in?
Yeah, thank you. Layered is, I think, the right word, because I feel like I want to offer a different perspective because from the local level, two examples come to mind. Actually, at our PCA convening recently, the group at my table talked about how there's so many open facilities, or we need to build more facilities so that people in the community can just come to them. And what I see is, tangible example, we have a local YMCA that's in the inner city, and the problem is that it's always empty. So it's free and it's available. The problem is getting the people to come. And the reason why it's hard to come is obviously transportation, parents work, but the other part is, oh, why don't they just walk? They can't walk because the neighborhood doesn't allow for the safety of that, right? I had an idea of running a free clinic at my alma mater, which is also in the inner city, just on Sunday, because to your point, Lino, so many people and parents are having to go further away, and that creates a barrier. But so I wanted to be able to create a space that was easily accessible for my community. And we run into that same issue of, it's not that the facilities necessarily aren't there and aren't accessible, it's actually getting to them. And I think that that's the socioeconomic barrier that we see. And that's why I think the race is so important. And then the other barrier that I want to talk about is cost. Also from from a coaching perspective, from a event planner perspective, and from a mother's perspective. Now my son is coming to me, he's 13, and he's like, track, basketball, baseball, football. And I had to sit him down. And what we did is I showed him the cost of all of these sporting events, and he had to pick one. And I think it was important for him to be able to tangibly see that these things do cost money, and to give our kids a sense of agency in what that is, because I do feel like what we see on the ground is kids have now an expectation to participate in these, competitive sports. And what we're not recognizing is that this is putting a barrier on parents to choose, right? Like, do I choose, maybe it's not as extreme as, do I choose to keep the lights on, or my child, participates in the sport, but we have to choose maybe going into debt so that my child doesn't feel like he's being left out. And I also, the last thing I'll say, I know this is getting kind of long-winded, is the cost to watch your child play. It is a huge barrier to entry, because sometimes we're allowed to, waive the fee to participate, but now we're charging $20, $30 to watch your child participate in 1 or 2 games a day. So for context, my son has a tournament every weekend for 6 straight weeks, and it's costing me $20 every day to go, not including gas, right? And so I had to collaborate with my son, and I want to offer to parents to collaborate with their children so that they don't have to carry that weight, so that we can hopefully start to, break the barrier a little bit by opening up realms of communication.
And I think that ties into some of the societal views of some of our community of not parents aren't engaged. and families aren't supportive. But oftentimes there are a number of barriers that are in place. In order to afford the season, I have to pick up another job. So I'm not going to be the one to do pickup and drop offs. And I can't afford to pay for everyone. Not everyone is a parent of one. So if I have 2 or 3 kids and I have to pay for admission for 2 or 3 kids, that means the family's not going to come to the game. And it looks as if there's a lack of support, but it means it's because there's so many financial barriers. There's so many things that are in the way that are making it difficult for us to show up the way that we want to show up for our Black youth who want to participate in sports. So I think you're bringing up a number of very important topics. And passing back to you, Lena, with the Urban Achievers School that I know you deal with, you are in a community that is very rich in culture. So you have a lot of different communities, possibly different languages spoken at home, and different perceptions of sport and the role that it plays in our youth development. So I would love to hear a little bit about how you navigate those different perspectives, and how you see the role of cultural perceptions and family support influencing their engagement in different type of sports.
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. I think what we see, often shapes what we believe, right? When we watch athletes in the NBA and the NFL who share our cultural backgrounds, I think it naturally fosters a sense of possibility, right? These sports feel real and achievable. And the underrepresentation of Black athletes in sports like swimming, golf, hockey, can make these activities feel unfamiliar, even unwelcoming at times. I think generations of exclusion, financial barriers, and limited opportunities have reinforced the idea that some sports simply aren't for us, right? And when I think of family support, I think it's incredibly crucial in breaking down these barriers. When families are able to provide financial resources, transportation, and emotional support, these young athletes are empowered to follow their passions. Unfortunately, I think, for many of us, the financial burdens and logistical challenges associated with these untraditional sports paths often make them seem out of reach, if that makes sense. Does that make sense at all? I know I'm rambling here a little bit, but I just think, again, what we see sort of shapes what we believe.
Absolutely. And I would love to hear a little bit about if there's some specific experiences that you can think of some youth that you looked at them and you like, I know the potential, I know the opportunities here, but unfortunately there's a lack of modeling that we either saw in society or at home that kind of created a non-existent barrier in their mind as to how they approach the sport.
Nick, could you rephrase that question? I do apologize.
Absolutely. I'm throwing you a curveball. It's okay. So are there any examples you can think of some of the young athletes you've worked with and you know that they have the potential, you can see it, and it was a little bit of let me walk you for a little bit so I can get you to see the potential that exists, because there aren't models in place that got them to that point where you could see it. But unfortunately, because of what you just mentioned, sometimes there isn't that level of, we don't see it. There's one Tiger Woods, and for a long time growing up, there was just Serena and Venus. But if we don't see multiple examples of it, then it's difficult to imagine it. So have you had any experiences with some of your students like that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And as we're, starting out, as a fresh school, I want to say it's not that it's been simple, but knowing that, the kids that are at our school, these are kids that, again, it's unfortunate, I want to say, because, the belief is that basketball is it, you know what I mean? And we're stuck on that. And even if there is potential, for other things, in my experience, it's been basketball, and nothing more than that, and it's unfortunate because I do believe that, a lot of these kids can be successful in many, many different areas, but we're not given the opportunities to do so. So that's been my experience. And so I wish I had something different to give you, but, as of right now, that's the only experiences that I've had with these kids.
Totally understand that and that makes a lot of sense. And Dr. Alexander, have you had any experiences that kind of resonate with what we're talking about of creating new doors?
Definitely. The organization itself, Black Women's Sports Foundation, actually next week has what we're calling a global alliance, and the students actually and the young ladies design their own program in terms. And Wendy Hilliard, who is out of New York, the Wendy Hilliard Foundation Gymnastics, she's coming down to speak, and the ESPN movie is going to be shown. So absolutely, it's made an impact. But I wanted to say, one of my youngest mentees, you've got to stay through the length of time. Okay. My youngest is 15 and she lives in Alabama. Okay. And she's basketball. Okay. But young people, you got to really enter and stay with them through the length of time, through wherever. One of my other mentees just finished getting her MBA and is doing quite successful at an accounting firm in Knoxville. So you've got to sort of follow the young people and get involved as mentors in their lives. And I think that's extremely important. And designing programs that give them opportunities that they are staying involved throughout their tenure, whether it's the school or outside organizations coming in to help and assist.
I love that perspective, that really building relationships and investing gives that opportunity to open their mindset to new opportunities and new options that they might have. Leveraging some of your experiences with your mentees, can you think of some experiences either that your mentees have had or that you personally experienced where racism, sexism, or some type of discrimination in sports settings has affected their retention as Black youth athletes?
Well, from way back, I remember being beat up at a particular game when I was playing basketball in college during a game. And I feel as though I was only Black on the team. I was targeted and unfortunately we were playing HBCU school, Central State. I have seen other instances, Howard University, in terms of their lacrosse and field hockey team, really targeted. They were on a bus, they were down south, and they were asked to get out of the bus, and the bus was searched. We have seen a lot of indication of field hockey and lacrosse, particularly in the Philadelphia area, are addressing racism. The young Black girls participating in, let's say, lacrosse programs and being targeted during competition and games and things of that sort. And if you want to go way back, I mean, historically, this has occurred. Tina Salone Green on the national level made the USA team, but when they were scheduled to go to South Africa, she was denied to go with the team. Same thing with Wendy Hilliard. She made the national team, but she didn't look. They wanted the same look, which was all white. And I could go on and on and on, but yes, there have been over the years several documentations of racism, particularly targeted in terms of young Black females.
Thank you. And I want to open up this next question to the whole group, thinking about all of these barriers that exist. Family support, financial, cultural barriers, lack of role models, oftentimes explicit or implicit racism or sexism, and forms of discrimination that are happening. What can we say to some of our youth in order to help them to persist and unfortunately build necessary resilience to stay in sport and continue to participate beyond these experiences that might normally derail their opportunities?
I mean, I would just say, I mean, I know it sounds cliche, but we have to be the change. So, they always say it starts in the home. I think within our own families, we've got to role model healthy spaces for our children to grow, to explore. One of the things that I was going to highlight a little later, I know we'll probably get into around mental health, is that oftentimes as adults, we project our expectations on the young people. We want them to be what we were, or, you know, be better than us. I think about how inspiring it is to see LeBron James and Bronny James playing together. But I think about, you know, the amount of pressure that that young man was under throughout his life, you know, that I'm being encouraged and expected to live up to this standard. And so for me, it's about listening. I think Jerica talked really powerfully about like empowering the young people to have agency, like us listening and working with them. There has to be a balance of you're still the parent and the authoritative figure, but you're also working with them to let them know that they have a choice in what goes on with their body. You know, there's so many young people who are forced to play sports when they really don't want to because the love of the game isn't there anymore. Maybe at one point they did love it, but because now it feels like a job, and I know we'll probably get into it before the session ends with name, image, and likeness, with all the benefits that come with that. Now we're getting into a larger conversation about child labor exploitation, where many parents and families are looking at their children as the economic engine for their families because of the influence that they could have on social media and or that. So to answer your question more concisely, we've got to listen to our children, not just in what they say, but what they're like, how they are feeling and being. Because at a lot of times, young people don't always have the language to communicate how they feel, but their body will tell you like, hey, I don't feel comfortable doing this, or I don't want to do this. And I know it's tough for parents when you say, hey, we've already paid for this. We don't want to waste this money. You got to continue doing it. But I think we've got to listen to them. I also think we've got to think creatively and expansively about sport and physical activity. It doesn't always have to be about competition and getting a Division I scholarship or being an elite athlete. What about doing activities with your children that promote physical activity for health and wellness? Like it's a bonding activity for family. Trying new things like what the Black Women in Sport Foundation do, like going on, if you have access to like an equestrian trip or playing putt-putt golf, even if you don't have access to a full golf course, but doing little things to get the young people engaged in a safe and fun manner. Because remember, it's about fun in their health and development, not always about being the best and winning and trophies and scholarships. So I think if we can role model that within our families, within our local communities, that can offset some of these negative trends that are happening all across the country.
I will say personally, I really prefer putt-putt to golf. So I completely support the idea of creating some family opportunities to be active, so that our youth don't feel like the only place they can engage in sports is in those spaces where they don't always feel welcome. So I am thankful for that. You did mention early on some reference to mental health implications, and I do want to take a second to explore that a little bit more. What are the mental health implications that you've uncovered in your research that show up as the barriers that youth face, and then how can they be addressed, either from an institutional standpoint or back again, putting some emphasis on family support?
Well, I'll start out with the first one, giving a shout out to PCA. The importance of many of our youth are being socialized by mentally unhealthy adults. And that creates an abusive, at worst, an abusive youth sport participation environment, at a minimum, an unpleasant environment. So we've got to be doing more trainings with our coaches, even with our parents, around understanding things like over parental involvement, things like communication styles, a social emotional awareness, how you communicate with different youth. People have different sensitivities. People have different vulnerabilities. Many of our youth have different trauma experiences that they have when they come into our spaces. And if you don't have adults who are social emotionally aware, they could unintentionally be exacerbating some of the trauma that the young people have experienced outside of the sporting space. So I think that that's one in terms of the training. The other things that I think a lot of our youth in the social media era has exacerbated it is this comparative culture. Like, I'm never good enough. I have to look like this person, or I have to be like this. So that gets into body image. That gets into, as I mentioned in my development, as a Black male, I don't feel Black enough or manly enough if I'm not excelling in a certain sport. And it's not always that somebody told me that, but it's just a confluence of messages that, oh, the Black young boys who do well in this, they get this kind of affirmation from the community. They get this kind of attention. And if I'm not one of them, I don't get that same kind of affirmation. And so we send messages to our youth. So I think some of the mental health has to do with trying to be the best as opposed to being the best version of yourself. Your personal best may not break a world record, but it matters that you did the best you could and you improved from when you initially started. The other thing that Lino touched on, and I think it's important, is this unfortunate delineation and separation between academic and athletic development. So oftentimes we talk about some of our scholar athletes, but normally if you are being highlighted as an athlete, there's not as much investment and celebration in your academic accomplishments. So now it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy that, okay, I'm just going to stay eligible. And that affects your mental health. Because a lot of our young people, every year that they matriculate in school, they're encountering different challenges and environments from elementary to middle school to high school to the college level. And we're not giving them the support that they need. So the mental health issues are so layered, as Jerica mentioned. And I mentioned like the mentally unhealthy adults. I was primarily referring to the coaches, but as all of the panelists have said, a lot of times in our families, in our communities, there's a lot of healing that hasn't fully taken place, and that impacts our young people. So, when they get out on the court, on the field, in the pool, or whatever their sporting venue, they view it as a safe haven. But the problem is when that space isn't safe anymore, then now everything else falls apart.
That goes back to something Lino mentioned earlier, that the sport was a major part of identity. And when that was challenged and kind of taken away from him, it really rocked him. So making sure we keep our safe sports spaces safe is huge. And also really appreciate the connection to how this is affecting them holistically. It isn't just your sports or your physical prowess, but also it can affect your academics and affect your mental health beyond that sport. Sport done the right way should build confidence, should create opportunities for you to almost fall in love with yourself. I know me personally, I hated how lanky I was as a kid until I started to play sports, and I could get rebounds over some girls, or I had a longer stride, so I beat them on the back 100. So like those things came out of sport, and it's unfortunate that it isn't happening as often due to so many other things. And like you said, we'll mention NIL in a moment, but the growth of this really hyper competitive experience has hit our community so heavily, and stripping it of these opportunities to grow a love for things. And I'll start with Jerica. When you think of like our coaches and our parents as leaders in these sports spaces, how do you think they can actively combat some of these trends associated with our youth, what we know to be directly affecting the mental health of social media and technological devices? Everyone says like, this is why the kids don't play, but how can we as coaches and parents and as orgs really be intentional about either co-opting those social media things and use them to our advantage, or how do we combat them and make sure that they're able to take advantage of sports and all the benefits that come from that?
Yeah, a few great questions, Daisha. Thank you. I have asked parents often come to me for advice about navigating the trajectory of their young student athlete's career and how they can best communicate with them, et cetera. And likewise, I have really strong relationships with the student athletes. And one question I found that I ask most of the parents that I have this conversation with: when your son or daughter graduates from high school, what is the one or two things that you want them to walk away with? And 100% of the time, it has something to do with a character trait. To Dr. Cooper's point, it's they want them to feel confident. Daisha, you said that, to feel confident, to feel validated, to feel affirmed, to feel courageous. 0% of them say, I want them to have a college scholarship to play sports. 0%. And where I push back is Now, are you communicating that to your child? Right? So to everyone's point, it starts at home. Coaches, yeah, I think I wrote down as Dr. Cooper was talking, I feel like we're kind of putting the pressure on our coaches and our parents to be trained psychologists, and we don't have that time or that ability to be trained psychologists, but I feel like we have that expectation. And so I think that to answer your question, I think I would offer some food for thought to be an intersection of availability of some professional, psychological work combined with parents being challenged to think about what it is we really want our children to walk away with, and even as coaches, because do we want them to be the most skilled? Do we want them to be sometimes, right? Like sometimes, but if we really unpack that, it's we want them to be affirmed. We want them to feel confident in the world that they're going into. We want them to feel confident in who they are in the world that they're in currently. I work with an organization that does basketball technology, Ballin, and they have developed this revolutionary technology that takes away the hope and offers parents and student athletes like knowing where they are in their like physical development and as it translates to, playing collegiately. And what we find is like, do student athletes really want the college scholarship, or do they want the affirmation that comes with getting the offer so that they can post it on social media? And that was really what we found, is like, it's not really I want to go play college sports. In some ways, yes, but deep down, I think more than the intrinsic motivation is, to your point of the social media aspect, and that's where you really have to do some real work, is I like what happens when I get the attention. I like the attention. And so I think that that's where, as parents and as coaches, we have to do a better job of, to Dr. Cooper's point, of listening to what our student athletes and our children really need. And sometimes they're not always able to articulate that. So also in that same token, offering a space to let them know, or, to empower them, hey, this is just your space to openly talk. And that's what I started to do in some more formal work that I've done in conducting surveys, is before I assume how you guys are using social media, I want you guys to tell me how you're using social media. And I did a survey, and 80+% of them said, I use it to distract myself from performance anxiety. 100, like, period, the end, full stop, for a distraction, right? And so is that what we think they're using it for? Maybe sometimes we think they're using it for to show their highlight reel. A lot of them don't even care about that. They kind of do that because they feel obligated, but for the most part, they want to distract themselves from either feeling too down about their performance or feeling too excited and they don't know how to calm their nerves. I think there was an answer to your question somewhere in there. So I'm just gonna leave it at that, but I think it's an intersection of kind of all of those things.
I love all of it. And I keep hearing like thorough lines between different things that you were saying, even echoing all the way back to Dr. Alexander's experiences of discrimination, coming forward to what you're saying of like, let's create spaces of affirmation. Let's create spaces where they feel affirmed, they feel listened to, as Dr. Cooper said, and they feel like they're seen and valued, because then they don't have the need for the other things to affirm them. They don't have to get a scholarship if they've been congratulated. Example, my daughter called me when I was on the road because she made her first 3-pointer 2 minutes into the game. It was not the winning shot. It didn't really actually affect anything in the game too much, but she was just so excited.
She felt good.
Felt great.
Yeah.
Because thankfully I'm blessed that I'm in a sports space. So I was able to put her on speakerphone. Everybody around me was just like so excited for her. So she got immediate affirmation from a crowd of folks who were just excited for her, and creating more opportunities for our youth to have a community of acceptance that is connected to sports will kind of drill down. Am I getting you right on what you were saying?
Girl, you're saying it better than me. Thank you. Yes, nailed it. Nailed it.
Perfect. And again, social media is not our enemy, but we have to figure out how we can make sure that it's not detrimental to their mental health. And just at the same, we know sports done well is a catalyst for youth development. it's not our enemy. We need to figure out how to create spaces that are supportive. And I'm gonna double right back to you, Jerica, because we're vibing now. Um, how do you think an overemphasis on competitive sports has impacted Black youth's relationship with physical activity? I know you just mentioned like they need the distraction, but in general, like the consistently increasingly more and more competitive environment of sports, how do you think that's impacted their relationship with physical activity as a whole?
That's really good. And I want to offer two perspectives. One, something just happened. So my son is 13. I am not 13, right? Like I'm a lot older than 13. We went and we ran a mile together. So I was obviously a high level athlete. We went and we ran a mile together. I'm not competitive in sports. My son is. And I immediately went to, I have to either be faster than him in the mile or like it was just this weird competitive thing. And my son is like, Mom, I don't care if you beat me in this in a mile. But what I saw in that moment was, this is the first perspective, being a competitive athlete really, for the earlier parts of my life affected me from a mental health standpoint. I feel like sometimes in a negative way, to constantly be focused on winning and, being the best when you step out there, which in a lot of ways is positive. But to your point, I think that there's negative attributes. For example, my son and a whole bunch of other people that I coach, with my son being the most personal example, and he's a young Black boy. And I think that girls and boys have different experiences because boys have the plight is different, right? They see the dollar signs, they see the NBA, like what that looks like. That's different than it is for girls. But so now my son is, and he's kind of always been like this. If I step out onto the field and I'm not the best, then to what everyone has been saying today, and I'm not the best, then what does that mean for me from an identity standpoint? Where is my space if I'm not the best? And as an adult who was a high performer, I still carry that with me, and so I think that the effects, the long-term effects of only having these competitive spaces that don't allow for fun, that don't, not even fun, but for joy, that don't emphasize the joy of the sport, ends up being very detrimental. And then I'll leave you with this other perspective, this last perspective. I was coaching at a high school in Michigan, and when I took over the program, there was no JV team. They said that they didn't have enough girls wanting to participate in the JV team. So I went to the hallways because I was like, administration doesn't know. So I need to go ask the girls and boys why they don't want to participate in JV. And they're like, varsity is too competitive. It's too competitive. We don't want to go and, put our whole life on the line to be these high level players. We just want to play with our friends, but we don't feel like there's a space for that. So it took me going into the hallways to, one, garner that understanding, because if I didn't have that understanding from the kids, then I wouldn't have molded the JV team or wouldn't have communicated to the girls, hey, this is a JV team that will allow you, we won't focus so much on winning a championship or whatever, the cultural expectations of being a champion. We'll take those off. And we had the most, like in the history of the 100-year school, the most girls try out for girls basketball ever. And I think it took, to our point of opening that line of communication and really understanding what what it is that the kids want and what they're asking for and what will allow them the space to not be competitive. And then there's still space for the people to be competitive, and then bring that more down to earth and make it more digestible for everybody.
Love the one woman bulldozer you are in creating opportunities wherever you go. That is extreme, and it connects to what Dr. Alexander is doing with the Black Women in Sports Foundation next week, of allowing girls to really take a first step and make sure their voices are heard. What we just said, make sure they're seen and heard, and they're able to develop something that is personal to them. What have you seen, Dr. Alexander, with initiatives like that have, what are the long-term results? So we said the long-term consequences of the over-competitive, but what are some of the long-term results when we do it the right way, so to speak, when we center our youth's voice and we create new opportunities and access points for them what have you seen with some of the girls that you've worked with?
Well, I have seen several things, and some of the success is implanted, like Robin Roberts. She participated in basketball, but she is a host on Good Morning America. So I've seen a wide range of participation and development of young women in that area. I think it's very important to think about, look at where we are. This is February 2025, and all in terms of encompassing, we just had Edwin Moses here, and he had a film that was shown at the university that I work at. It's called 13 Steps. Everybody needs to see this film. But in terms of the whole development and the strength throughout his life, you know, he called himself even, he said the other day when he was here that, you know, he was knuckle, like knucklehead that had glasses on, you know. So the whole length of the development and exposure, I think also it's important to know how you take care of at an early age your body, and in terms of what you do in terms of diet and food and things of that sort, and also physical development. The experience outside of the norm. There is basketball, there's all these sports, but what about trying some other activities and get families involved and inclusion? But I think it's extremely important, and Arthur Ashe, he probably is one of the most brilliant athletes I ever knew. He was very smart, he was athletic, and he also gave back. And so when you give back in terms of developing, you have your sons and daughters, but also I know everybody on this panel has a wealth of people that they have assisted, young people. And when you get 20 or 30 years from now, you'll look back and say, wow, that I made a difference in that youth's life. So just, I think those are some of the things that are involved with that.
I love the examples that you're giving of how sport has been a catalyst for success that's completely non-sport related. Before you talked about you had a mentee who has an MBA in accounting, not sport related, but the idea that, and I say this all the time everywhere I go, and I'll keep saying it, every single athlete we touch is going pro in something. So we are prepping them for the pros in some aspect of life, and it doesn't need to be sports. And recognizing that is really vital. Lino, as you have created and opened Urban Achievers, I love the fact that you are really marrying or reincorporating academic success and athletic success, where oftentimes it's separated and considered something different or in competition with each other. And with that in mind, how can we, as coaches, as parents, or as orgs, choose your audience, choose your journey, but how can we shift the focus from just athletic development and achieving the scholarship, which, as Jerica mentioned, is almost never someone's actual goal. How do we bring that back to prioritizing holistic wellness, like the physical and mental health, and like understanding personal growth and personal bests as our indicators?
Yeah, thank you for that. At our school, I think one of the biggest things that we focus on is relevancy, right? Where our kids, you know, when I think back to my journey and growing up, it was easy for me to walk away from school because it didn't mean anything to me. The only thing that meant something to me was basketball, right? Where I was growing up, it was all about relevancy, right? Basketball meant everything to me. So when she put me in a position to make a decision whether or not it was going to be basketball or school, it was easy for me to walk away from school because they weren't teaching me anything, at least not where I came from, that I felt was relevant or necessary for me to sort of to become successful at. So, you know, with that, I think about when we were sitting down to design Urban Achievers, the one thing that we wanted to do was to make sure that it was relevant, right? Because, and not just relevant in terms of basketball, but relevant in all aspects. So using sport to power academics, right? So now we create a bridge with basketball. When you think of basketball, it touches pretty much every discipline. There's not anything that I can't think of that it doesn't touch. So, our thing was to make sure that we create a curriculum where basketball touch math. You talk about statistics, you talk about things of that nature. You're talking science. How does it touch science? You're talking biology, anatomy and physiology, nutrition, all these things that really matter to us as athletes. And that's where we spent a good amount of our time to make sure that when this child comes to our school, he may not be thinking, oh, yeah, well, in this case, it's all boys right now until maybe a few years from now when we open a sister school, definitely coming. But when he comes in and he sits down in his classroom, this speaks to him directly. He's not sitting there off in la la land like I used to be back in the day, like, man, this is so boring. I'm not even thinking about this. But knowing that everything that I learn in these classrooms are actually going to help me on the court as well, right? So it's sort of just building that bridge. And that's one of the things that we had really focused on, is to make sure that, number one, our curriculum was solid. And then even, beyond that, or more importantly, Dr. Cooper had touched on the health and well-being of our children, right? To me, that's of critical importance as well. As we think about student athletes, and again, I'm always going back to my situation and, so many different experiences, knowing that the health and well-being of our students is of critical importance. We spend a lot of time making sure that there's dedicated mental health and wellness teams within the program, making counselors, nutritionists, and life coaches easily accessible to our student athletes. That way they know where to turn when they need it, because it's going to come, right? I've experienced several injuries during my time in my journey. And I know when I ruptured my knee, when I tore my patella tendon, it was the worst experience ever. And then from a psychological standpoint, I was lost. I was just like, where do I turn? Who do I look to? Nobody understood. So making sure that, we have these people in place, not, hopefully no one's going to go through that at the school, but making sure that these people are in place in case, they do cross that, that bridge, and find themselves in a situation where, they can go to one of the the sports psychologists and talk to them. So before they even get to that place, we're talking about transitioning. We're talking about these certain instances. So, if they do happen, these kids are actually prepared for what's to come.
And are there any other examples, Dr. Hooper, that you can think of across the nation of ways that organizations have really figured out how to take that emphasis off of that over-competitive model and really bring it back to what we know sport is good at, and those avenues for mental health and physical health and personal growth?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, obviously, the Urban Achievers Academy here in Boston. There's a sporting men's tennis enrichment center, STEC, that does great work. Another sport-based community organization called The Base, which has a foundation with baseball, but they also use a multitude of sports to provide a platform for the young people to get access to other resources. So, as Lino mentioned, with all of these organizations, and I would also say a lot of our faith-based organizations, so a lot of our churches, our mosques, our temples have been able to combine some of the faith-based content that they're providing with summer enrichment programming and physical activity in sports. So when you talk about like developing healthy mind, body, and spirit, there's a consistent messaging that your wellness is integrally connected to the wellness of this community. And so setting high expectations, but also providing adequate support for the youth to meet those high expectations so that they realize that, as you mentioned, Deja, that the positive socialization through sport is all about their holistic development, not how many trophies they win, not whether they get a scholarship or not. It's great to pursue that. And if you are able to get access to financial support for college, for your athletic abilities. That's wonderful. If you're able to travel the world or travel to different parts of your state or the region through sport, that's great. But the end goal isn't just about, the performance. That's a part of it, but it's really more about, as everyone has said, about the journey. What are you learning in your improvement? You're learning how to develop discipline. You're learning how to work with others. You're learning how to make mistakes, fall short, experience adversity, and overcome it. So it's all about these life lessons. So there are a lot of organizations across the country that are being intentional about using sport for development, not just sport for performance. And I think that's a big thing. And I think Jerica mentioned it earlier, like how we're communicating to the young people. They hear what we say, but they watch what we do. And if we say like, hey, sport, it's all about fun, it's no big deal, but the only people who get celebrated or who get attention is the child who ended up getting MVP or the one who, broke the record. So we've got to make sure that our actions are matching our words, and there are a lot of communities that are doing that. The one thing that I also will mention is a lot of the organizations in the city, the end of season ceremonies, the organizations that do the most impactful work to me, they have equal or larger awards for the young people who engaged in most improved, leadership, community engagement, academic achievement. So it signals to them that what's valued among us isn't just that you scored the most goals, that you scored the most points, you made the most tackles, but that you're the well-rounded character development. We're seeing your growth and we're rewarding that.
Love that. It ties back again to something Jerica mentioned of really taking a moment to step back and identify what your values are and what you value, and then how are you actually walking in that. If the values are, I want the youth who are participating in this organization to walk away with a certain level of confidence in themselves, then it isn't just about the wins, and figuring out how to make sure that that is exemplified in all of your work and your day-to-day in your games as well as in your celebrations. So that is really, really a large thing that everyone can take home as actionable things that we can put into place. And I want to take that exact same thought process and Jerica and Lena really thinking about pulling that into conversations with parents. Because even though there are organizations who are offering these opportunities, what we also know is society and media still glorifies the ones who actually make it every single time, who make all the points, the Currys and the top runners and the top players at all levels. Those are the ones who get the deals. We know that. So combating that, how can parents really encourage their youth to stay engaged in physical activity beyond just competition and the potential for a scholarship or financial gain? What type of conversations and intentional statements can they say to pour into their youth in order to help them to stay connected when we know that there's so many other messaging that's coming from outside the home?
Jerica, I'm gonna let you run with that. I think you've been on point and all through this, so I'm gonna let you run with that and try to bounce off of what you
Okay.
cover. Is that all right?
Yeah, pressure's on. I'm here for it. High performer.
Good. Let's go. Let's go.
How can parents encourage youth to stay involved in sports activity? So going back to my son again, we went to the park yesterday. Mom, can we go shoot around? Can we go? And a few months ago, so I've worked with NBA players and stuff, and he's been there and he sees that. And so he's like, some of the times, like, can you put me through this workout? And what I realized is that every time we go to the field, because he's a quarterback too, so every time we go to the field or go to the court, he's been blessed with his coach mom. Like, not to toot my own horn, but like not every mom can like throw a football and shoot a basketball and like do all these things with their kid, right? And so I said to him, I said, son, not everybody has access to this kind of stuff. And he goes, well, you're my mom. I'm not talking about everybody else. I'm talking about you. So, but what I noticed in that moment, it was like yesterday, I said to myself, let's just play. like, we don't have to train, like, let's just play. And it was, it took me back to when he was little, and I read somewhere, as a parent, there's like no better joy than watching your child at play, like on a playground, just like having fun, laughing. And I think as parents and as coaches, we get so immersed. So we're here on this panel, we're talking about how our kids, or how the culture has amplified this competitive nature in sports. And I don't think that we take credit enough. Like, a lot of that comes from us, right? Like, a lot of that comes from the adults. Like, the adults set the tone. My partner said it best to our son, like, we set the tone for you. So if we're creating this environment that's like uber competitive all of the time, or every time you get in the car, I'm gonna answer the question. Every time you get in the car, after a game, as a coach, every time right after a game, I'm just dissecting everyone's performance, then that's what our kids are gonna follow. So a tangible example I have is, as a coach, and I took this from another coach. She said that after a game, she never assessed the game with the player. She gave herself 24 hours to go home, watch film, do it, to let the emotion of the competition pass. And I adopted that as a coach. And I think I'm adopting that now as a mom, where it takes the intensity of winning, of performing, of competition, and it brings it back down to where, hey, like, let's just fellowship together. Hey guys, great game. Thanks for showing up. See you guys tomorrow at practice. Then at practice, I'm able to come back and be a better coach, because now I was able to, it's never as good as it seems. It's never as bad as it seems. I'm really not that mad that she missed that layup. It doesn't really matter. Son, did you have a good time? But in the moment, it's really hard to separate that. And so I think a tangible practice is maybe give it some time, right? Like, 24-hour rule for ourselves, for parents, right? Like, as soon as our kids get in the car, maybe we talk about, something else. We talk about school, we talk about, your grandmother's birthday party, and we don't flood the environment with language around competition. So those are like tangible things that I feel like, I would offer as food for thought.
Wow. Thank you for that. That's definitely a ton. I really appreciate it. Now, where I was leaning toward is, just thinking about how so many of us are conditioned to believe that athletic success is the ultimate goal, right? So I'm sort of, somewhere different, right? Just thinking about how athletic success is the ultimate goal, and how we've grown up with these images of athletes on the biggest stage with these, dreams of fame and fortune and recognition, which sort of makes it hard to see the broader, value of sports beyond competition, right? And one of the things that, I love to focus on with our families is sort of shifting that mindset, right? It's sort of, I think it's essential that we challenge the narrative that athletic achievement is the sole measure of success, if that, makes sense. I'm thinking that we need to expand the definition of success. It's not just about reaching the pros, it's about thriving in life. And I think that's the biggest thing right there, right? So often we're thinking about pros and going on to the next level. And we're not thinking about, not many of us are thinking about it from a life perspective. Whether that means sort of excelling in academics, contributing to the community, or finding balance in one's well-being. I think by shifting the focus, from strictly the competition to, what you have mentioned, right? Holistic development, like all of the stuff that you had mentioned. I believe we can help our youth understand that their value is not tied to just that athleticism, but to the multifaceted people that they are.
I love that. It really exemplifying valuing their joy and valuing their opportunities for growth over whatever the score was or whatever the stat is. I'm a parent that struggled with that. My two oldest daughters decided to be cheerleaders. I was like, God, I'm not your strongest soldier. So I had to learn to like really be supportive. And then when they got in college, one of my daughters decided to be a collegiate tumbler. And I was like, this is like cheerleading without rhythm. It's really hard for me to be supportive, but understanding this is where they found joy and being able to support that. And it also tied in other things. Dr. Cooper, freshman 15 is real, especially now. I think it was like freshman 25, but then she decided to start doing tumbling. Suddenly she wanted to talk about macros. And she wanted to talk about like, how should I do a balanced breakfast? As a college student, she wanted a balanced breakfast because she was engaged in her collegiate tumbling team. And recognizing and supporting that and honoring that. I think a lot of times as parents, we want our kids to pick up where we left off and go a little bit further, and taking, as you said, Jerica, taking that pressure off of them from inside the house because they get enough of it outside. How do we really elevate conversations around success and exploring success? And how do we have conversations around mental wellness and joy and resilience as the emphasis, not the free throw, or was your golf swing correct? Or like your stature when you were running, like that, we could have fixed that. We don't need to talk about those things on the way home. There are so many other things in life to discuss, and really changing those would be are great ways for parents to show up for their youth and really model what's important and keeping the important things important in the household. I think both of you also mentioned like the goal is the fame and fortune. And with recent shifts with NIL, that fame and fortune feels real close as our varsity sports. It's right there. So thinking about that, Dr. Alexander and Dr. Cooper, what are some of the pros and cons that you are either currently seeing or that you are forecasting as we see more young athletes pursue these endorsement deals and influencer status at such a young age, where previously you had to become a professional athlete? Now, as a college student, possibly 17 years old, you might be looking at endorsement deals and becoming a national influencer. How do you see this? What are the ramifications that you think will come from this, both pros or cons?
I'm gonna let Dr. Cooper take this, but I do want to point out gender makes a difference. And so in terms of our previous conversations, think about it. And then think about the model that Kobe was trying to instill, how he was very supportive of his daughter. The last time I saw Kobe, he was at the WNBA All-Star game with his daughter. So what can men contribute to their daughters in terms of involvement in sport in all types of areas, whether it's fun or whether it's on the competitive side? So I want you to think about that. I'm gonna let Dr. Cooper take it, and then I have some things that people shouldn't get involved with, some of the detriment of the NIL.
Well, actually, let's stay with you, Dr. Alexander, and talk about a little bit of those things that they shouldn't. I'm sure Dr.
Okay.
Cooper wants to respond because he's a girl dad, but I'm gonna
Okay.
get to Stu, and let's talk a little bit about some of the cons that you're seeing coming from NIL.
Well, first of all, the legal and the financial commercial aspect of it is extremely important. If in fact you're being approached that your young child should enter a contractual agreement, you really should think about that and get a lawyer to representation. Some of the consequences of it, it could be limitations of your future opportunities. If you're locked up in a contract, you're not going to be able to do X or Y. Inadequate compensation, just like the price of eggs. The eggs are sky high now, but maybe you entered the agreement that you get paid, you know, with the original price of the eggs were $2 and something. Now it's like $14. And then also, how are you going to craft your personal brand and identity, and the possible misalignment of that? Okay, if you're going to start out as A and then you're going to turn into B and you want to be B, then you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to stick with the brand and the contract that you locked in yourself on. And then also locking yourself in terms of long-term agreement. And I think another thing is to be prepared. Some of the athletes that are representing different brands now, they're not trained and I was put in a tank and trained in terms of public speaking and things of that sort. So in terms of really getting themselves ready for a positive image, particularly a lot of the athletes that I've seen on certain brands, they should not be on TV advertising the product. And I'll shut up now.
No need. I think what you're saying of a lot of preparation is necessary. I think people are not recognizing that this is a career move for that often is happening by children. Not recognizing, as I tell my girls all the time, college years are light years. Who you are when you walk in first semester or freshman, they are gonna your senior self is gonna laugh at who that freshman was. So thinking about locking into a contract, you may not even align with that brand in 4 years. That may not be something that works with you, and you may be very, very cringy. And when you think of some of the interviews you did, because you put yourself in a position to have the spotlight at such an early age. So I think a number of the things you said, there's no need to stop talking, because you said a lot of things that are very important to think about as entering into contractual agreements as a young person. That is something to take in consideration. Dr. Cooper, what are your thoughts in regards to the current situation with NIL and these opportunities that are arising for our young youth?
Yeah, I mean, I think the framing is spot on. There's opportunities and there's challenges, and you can't ignore either one. I'll highlight a number of the positives. One, for the longest time, the NCAA, a lot of grassroots youth sport organizations, athletic apparel brands were exploiting these talented athletes and youth for their name, image, and likeness. And so to me, the fact that now that, to me, a basic human right that you should be able to benefit off of your own name, image, and likeness is granted widespread, I think that's a benefit. At a younger age, people understand their professional value, not their holistic value, because that should be priceless and invaluable, but that your brand, who you are, what you do, how it's viewed in certain markets and certain spaces, I think that's important. And I think that's a positive. So that's one. Two, for a lot of these young people who will not matriculate to the professional level, some of their highest earning years as it relates to their athletic ability and visibility is going to be at the college level, high school level, or even at the youth level. So if they can generate some level of income, even though it might not always translate to intergenerational wealth, in some cases it may, then I think that could be beneficial. The other thing that I think is that it's helping young people at an early age understand that various aspects of life are businesses. And so when you think about cultivating the athlete-preneur, I have a number of my former college classmates and others who do a lot of athlete-preneurship work, where they're helping athletes understand financial literacy, how to manage a business, how do you utilize relationships, marketing, and all of that. I think that that's great, because I think for the longest time, we've kind of promoted this infantilization of our young people. Like, it's a little bit too paternal, maternalistic. Like, they need to be able to learn about taxes at a younger age, right? So if you sign this contract, you do this deal, you need to understand this is how you're going to have to file your taxes, right? You know, these, as Jerica mentioned, talking with her son, hey, when we go to these things, this is how much it costs. So if you're going to be generating income, you also have to think about, how am I investing in myself and my development? So I do think it could be used as a healthy way to develop young people, giving them opportunities. And I do think, even though it's not fully leveling the playing field, there are a number of young people who, prior to the name, image, and likeness rule changing, were really shut out of certain economic opportunities that I think now is kind of opening it up in that regard. But to Dr. Alexander's point, there are a number of negatives that come with it. And, you know, some of that is the illusion of temporary celebrity. And, you know, you got young people who are obsessed with how other people view them. You know, did I get this many likes, this many follows? I'm an influencer now. And that's a lot of pressure on a young person to try to maintain an image. I think about the young man, Mikey Williams. I believe he's at the University of Central Florida now. He was, you know, highly touted. I think he might have a shoe contract with Puma. He was originally committed to go play at Memphis with Penny Hardaway, but he got involved in a firearm charge in California, I believe, and was in some legal trouble. And now he seems to be, you know, back on the right track, at least enrolled in school. But I think to myself, just that celebrity culture and that social, like, always kind of performing, not just athletically, but you're putting on an image, that can be exhausting for a young person. If you always feel like you have to be representing a brand or corporation, you don't really get to be a young person anymore. So in some ways, your childhood, I mean, there's countless stories of Hollywood childhood celebrities who later gotten into addiction, who've later had other, issues later as adults. And so we've got to be mindful of some of those trends as well.
Thank you. I think from what I'm hearing, it's very similar to how we see sports. When things are handled the right way, it can be an access point, it can be an opportunity. When it's handled poorly, it can be detrimental, and it can have like ongoing impact beyond the first contact, as Dr. Alexander spread out. My next question, I'm opening up to everyone. One of the things that is clear from how quickly the name, image, and likeness, how that legislation has opened up the door and immediately took hold, it shows, it puts light on the financial barriers that exist in several of our communities. Most of our Black youth are coming from historically and intentionally under-resourced communities. So the opportunity for financial gain as a result of athletics is undeniable and hard to resist. So how do we balance that desire for the scholarships or for those professional contracts that can pop up with what we know to be like the actual true gem of sports, developing lifelong skills beyond just like the actual athletic ability? How do we help, and what advice would you give to our attendees in regards to balancing those things, since we know that that's an actual desire that exists and it's realistic, but how can they balance that and still put some emphasis on developing lifelong skills as a result of sport activity? Jerica, go for it.
Okay.
Everyone sees you. You got something in mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, so my partner played in the NFL, so he came into a lot of money really quick. And we talk about this with our son recently, was you're not ready to get NIL money, son, because you're going to get a lot of money really quick and you don't know what to do with it. What I started observing in him and other high schoolers that I coached, that I've had players that went on visits and got offered money, was how, and this might be an interesting perspective, how actually disconnected they are from money. Like the kids aren't, like, they don't really associate, hey, I want to go make $1 million, because they can't, it's not digestible for them yet. They don't have responsibilities, they don't have bills. And so they don't really connect with money yet. So where I see that showing up is more with the parents. It's the parents that want the money. It's the coaches that want the money. And the kids, if from my, just being feet on the ground, they're just following suit, right? Like, oh, well, okay, if NIL is a thing, that's, my parents are saying that's a thing, that my coaches are saying that's a thing that I'm seeing pop up. I have these NIL, scouting service, platforms that are contacting me through social media. Maybe I'll respond. But from what I see, there is a real disconnect from the actual student athlete and the money. And so I think, to your question, Daisha, I think it's financial literacy for the adults, because to everyone's point, if the money is on the table, that's a real thing. To my partner's point, are we going to know what to do with it when it comes? Do we have an attorney in place to articulate this contract for us? We don't have the knowledge, right? Like, my parents didn't teach me about money. And so I think this generation, we have an opportunity to teach our kids about money at a much younger age. But I think it can be almost like a seed of financial literacy, even disconnected from NIL. So to the point of like talking to my son about budgeting, it's not just budgeting around sports. Now that's opened up a greater conversation around just, budgeting, period, right? Where it's like, hey, we're just not going to eat out as much. We're going to go eat, to Dr. Alexander's point, eggs cost $21 a crate out here in California. We're not doing that. And it's not necessarily because we don't have $21, but because that just doesn't make sense. And so I think that language is really important, but I do want to offer really being realistic about what's digestible right now for kids and the expectations that we're putting on them. I don't think that they have the wherewithal that we assume that they do. I think that I would challenge the adults to seek financial literacy for themselves.
I I would like to say that pointing out some good examples is LeBron James and Curry in terms of types of things that they've been able to accomplish with their money, like the school in Akron. And then also in some of the things that Serena and other high-level athletes have really exhibited and shown. But I totally agree. The financial literacy and educational aspect is extremely important. And in terms of really training in terms of how to represent yourself throughout this whole venture in terms of presentation and things of that sort are extremely important. And gender does matter.
And I was going to say,
It does matter.
I do want to also specifically talk about that, Dr. Alexander, if you don't mind staying with me for a little, like come back off mute. What specific barriers have you seen that are the most looming, leading to the drop off of Black girls in sport and physical activity? And how can we actively combat those issues?
Well, research has proven that young girls drop off significantly at the age of 12, 13. And so they're widely distracted. Okay. And so unless they have some type of system that is in place to encourage their participation at a young age and throughout, and a lot of African-American girls are not capable in terms of some of the barriers that we talked about earlier. Their families don't have the money to be able to continue on because of AAU level play and every weekend, and it's down about 2 hours away due to transportation and things of that sort. That is one of the crucial things, the barriers that we talked about earlier, I think really impacts for young girls. And then the attention in terms of their growth availability. They grow and mature quicker than boys, and you know that. Boys have to catch up. So in terms of coaching, do they have role models in terms of Black females to look at up to? I think is extremely important. We know that in terms of women's sport, the large percentage of the coaches are male. And so what impact is that? And the examples that we've shown, for example, the NCAA national championship, the differentiation between the women workout area versus the men's workout area. So society has proven to us in terms of where the differentiation and based on gender is. And I think the accessibility, and let me say one other thing, don't be fooled, okay? Media is controlled, and who is in the media? Yes, we have some that have entered that market that look like us, but there's not a lot in terms of being able to get our true stories out there. So I think that's extremely important. And I'll let other people talk now.
I don't think representation can be highlighted enough. Just by show of hands on this call, who has ever been coached by a woman of color?
I had one assistant coach. That's the only one, and I had to rack my brain to remember that.
The limited number of experiences that people have of seeing women of color in those leadership roles, Black women as coaches or as the AD or as those roles in sports spaces, has a direct effect on the sense of belonging that our Black girls have. And I do think that echoes everything that you're saying, Dr. Alexander, that there's not only a lack of access to sports that Girls and Black Women in Sports Foundation has combat and Jerica single-handedly has fought against, but there's also a lack of representation across the board intentional or implicit. And I think there's so much work to be done. We've really elevated a number of barriers. We've talked about the cultural implications. We talked about transportation as transportation as financial reasons, but also transportation. Jerica, you mentioned in certain neighborhoods, you can't cross over those particular streets to get to that park to play the sport, and that's not always recognized. We talked about the lack of family support sometimes that is either motivated by a cultural difference and not recognizing the value of a sport for that athlete, or sometimes it's a financial reason that you're not seeing parents, they're not able to engage at the level that they'll want to. We talked about the lack of education, as well as the lack of physical literacy and representation. If each of you can think of one of those in particular, one barrier, get that in your mind of what one you want to talk about. How would you want to leave as a final thought? How each of us can contribute to making sports a better space for growth and wellness, and combating that particular barrier so that our young athletes can experience success beyond just the game. And I'm going to put him on the burner and start with Dr. Cooper, and then we'll move through our panelists as we opened up originally.
No, I appreciate that, Deja, and thank you again, co-panelists, attendees. This has just been a fruitful discussion. I've learned a lot. I was taking notes, as others were talking. But I would conclude this is an easy one for me because I've been dedicated my life to this, is the prevention of athletic identity foreclosure. And this idea that your most valuable asset, particularly as a Black person, whether woman, man, non-gender binary conforming person, is what you do with your body, and really helping people understand that your mind is connected to your body, and who you are and what you do with your body. It's more than just the sport you play. Sport is what you do, not all of who you are. So my closing remarks would be what we've been developing over the past couple of years is the EBA model, Excellence Beyond Athletics. We talk about holistic development principles, and we particularly refer to the young people we work with as holistic athletes. So before they're an athlete, they're holistic, and they're reminded in that every time we refer to them. And the basic formula is conditions, relationships, and expectations. So as all of my co-panelists have mentioned, we have to think critically, what are the conditions that we're creating for our young people within sport and outside of sport? We always say when young people say sport is my sanctuary or my safe haven, that says more about their life outside of sport than it does in sport. And that's the problem, is that shouldn't be the only place, and that shouldn't be. So let's think about the conditions. Relationships, let's be intentional about, as Dr. Alexander and Jerica have mentioned, let's expose our young people to role models who look like them in different roles in sport, leadership, management. Jalen Hurts has an all-woman sport agency team. Let's highlight that. Let's spotlight that. Let's highlight Black women who own their own brands, and Black men who are owning or doing different things connected to sport, and even those who are outside of sport. So what type of relationships are we developing? And then the last one is expectations. All youth, they recognize two basic things: rewards and consequences. So what's incentivized, I'm going to pursue more, and what is penalized, I'm more likely to not do as much. So let's make sure that the expectations are balanced in terms of what we're expecting of them in certain spaces versus others.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Dr. Alexander, when you think of a barrier, what would you want people to leave with, and how can they create more opportunities for our youth to really experience success beyond the game?
Well, I just want to say, I really appreciate being on this distinguished panel, and my heart is full with every single one of y'all. It just gives me joy. So to say all of that, it leads to what the mission of the Black Women's Sports Foundation is about, and why we co-founded it together and have pursued over 30+ years. So consequently, for me, being able to be a role model and being able to give back and see, particularly the young people, and stick with them throughout whatever journey and whatever they want to become. I want to also give a food for thought. This is 2025, futuristic wise. You got AI coming up, you got social media, you've got political things that are happening. How do we survive through all and go forward and really enable our youth to be able to come forward and be what we see them and their capabilities of being, particularly African-American females and males?
Thank you. That's with some of those reflective thoughts. Lino, what would you want our attendees to leave with as some final things to have nuggets on?
Sure. Thank you. First and foremost, I too want to say that you know, it's been an honor being here. I've learned so much just sitting here myself. It's crazy. You know, I was sitting here jotting down notes, so I really appreciate all of you and everything you've added to the discussion. I think looking back on my journey, you know, sports taught me, you know, far more than just how to play the game. You know, like most athletes, I was driven by the dream of going pro. You know, but over time, I began to realize that the mindset and skills I gained through sports translated into my academic and personal life, right? So once, you know, I understood that, you know, I was learning what I was learning on the court could help me succeed in other areas, you know, it was like a light bulb went off, you know, like all this stuff really translated. It gave me the confidence to know that I could make it outside of playing basketball. You know, I think that that's one of, you know, the key to balancing the pursuit of athletic success with long-term development is first recognizing that sports are also a tool for learning life skills, not just for winning games. You know, when we begin to recognize the connections between athletic development and these critical life skills, we begin to shift the narrative. You know, sports isn't a detour from education or career preparation, but a direct path to cultivating those competencies that define success in today's world. And that's what I would love to leave with people.
And narrative changes is necessary for us to have some effective long-term impact. So thank you very much.
Sure.
Finishing up, Jerica, when you think of all your experiences with athletes at multiple levels, what would be a final thought that you would want to give to parents, leaders, and coaches who are listening today about how to create a sports space that really cultivates long-term success beyond just the game?
I think the one thing that comes to mind, to your point, there's so many barriers, they're layered, they can't all be knocked down at once. It's easier said than done. And I think showing up and doing the work in spaces like this is such a key step. So I'm honored to be amongst my fellow panelists and you, Daisha, and PCA. But the one thing I would want to leave people with is bringing it back to women and girls in sports, just to put a highlight on that, to give them, and all, I have a son too, so I have to speak for him too, but to give our youth a voice. I think that as adults, we, you know, lead the way, we set the tone, we set trends. And I think that as we're trying to figure out ways to break down some of these barriers in sports to, like Dr. Alexander is saying, like to stay engaged for the long haul, we have to continue to listen, but also like to listen to our youth, but also understand they're not always going to be forthright about using their voice. And so really giving them a stage to be heard is something that in my work with Her Power and getting stories from these girls, I'm intentionally highlighting who they are outside of basketball, outside of soccer, outside of whatever it is. And when I go in and I put a microphone on them and I put a camera in front of them, they were very timid and nervous to start. And then over time, you see them transform into their own power and recognize, oh my goodness, I'm all of these things. And at the end of the conversation, what they see is how little the sport actually has to make up who they are. It is a part of what they do, but they see that it's a tool they have in their toolbox that helps, you know, them thrive in so many other ways. And I think that giving them a voice, giving them a stage to use their voice is a key way to lead our kids in the right direction while collaborating with the goodness that is sport.
Love that. Thank you so much. I know you guys are all thankful to me, but I'm just so happy that you joined us and had this conversation, took the time out to really share each of your lived experiences as well as the research and the lived experience that you have. As we wrap up today's conversation, one thing is abundantly clear. Black youth deserve more than just a pathway to competition. They deserve access, they deserve support, and they deserve the freedom to engage in sports and physical activity in ways that nurture their whole selves. Whether it's expanding opportunities beyond the mainstream sports, prioritizing mental health, or ensuring young athletes are valued beyond their potential for scholarships and contracts, we all have a role to play in creating change. As coaches, educators, sports leaders, and parents, let's make sure that every young athlete feels welcome and supported, no matter their background or their skill level or gender. Parents and guardians, keep pushing for spaces where your kids can thrive, not just as an athlete, but as whole individuals. And for those who have the power to make bigger changes, let's work on getting more resources and opportunities in place so that all Black youth have a fair shot at participating in sports their way. This conversation does not end here. It cannot end here. So let's all continue to work together to break down barriers, create new opportunities, and build pathways forward that truly support the next generation of Black athletes, not just in sports, but in life. Thank you all for being a part of this discussion. Have a great Black History Month.
Thank you.